This slideshow is about John B. Watson, who many would consider the founder of behaviorism. The next slide talks about the impact that Watson had on behaviorism. Some scholars contest the thesis that Watson was the creator of the behaviorist movement, but he's still a significant figure in the history of psychology. He undoubtedly popularized behaviorism, and many of the psychologists who have proposed new varieties of behaviorism admit that they were directly influenced by Watson. At some point in their apprenticeship, most psychologists and just about every behavior analysis have heard or read about Watson. The third slide talks about Watson at the University of Chicago in 1900. As a young functionalist at Chicago, he was attracted to comparative psychology. His interest in animal psychology shaped his beliefs about psychology in general. In reflecting on his time spent in Chicago, he stated that he had always felt uncomfortable with introspective methods and human subjects, but he had always felt at home with animal subjects. The Watson and Carr Maze Studies, 1903 to 1908. His most important research at his time in Chicago was the study involving rats in mazes. Those studies were completed with Harvey Carr, who at the time was a graduate student at Chicago and later became an important member of the functionalist movement and eventually chair of Chicago's psychology department. Johns Hopkins, 1908, as Watson was known by professional colleagues as an up-and-coming star when it came to the world of experimental psychology. He also began to feel unappreciated in Chicago, so when he was offered more than double his salary by Johns Hopkins University, he couldn't refuse. In his third decade, he found himself in charge of the psychology department. The next 12 years before he was fired for moral grounds, he cemented his reputation as a leading researcher in the world of animal psychology, proclaimed behaviorism, and developed a program of research in child psychology with an emphasis on emotional development. Watson and Animal Behavior, 1909. Once he settled into his new position at Johns Hopkins University, he launched a wide-ranging program of research in animal behavior. Some of the research was basic laboratory variety and included work in animal psychophysics. He had studied the visual abilities of several species by training them to make choices between pairs of slightly different stimuli. Watson's Behaviorist Manifesto, 1913. When he was invited to speak at Cattell University, he believed he had enough stature to proclaim that it was time for the field to move away from introspective psychology of consciousness and move toward a psychology of behavior. His lecture from Columbia was later published with the provocative title, Psychology as a Behaviorist Views It, and it has become to be known as the Behaviorist Manifesto. The opening sentence sets the tone for what Watson proclaimed. Psychology as the behaviorist views it is purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is prediction and control of behavior. Introspection forms no essential part of its methods, nor is the scientific value of its data dependent upon the readiness which they lend themselves to interpretation in terms of consciousness. Watson's APA Presidential Address, 1913 to 1915. In his presidency, he worked hard to provide evidence to support his strong beliefs. In the opening paragraph of his presidential address, he stated, "It is one thing to condemn a long-established practice, but quite another thing to suggest anything in its place." Watson was eager to describe to his peers the method of conditioning of two varieties of reflex, which are salvatory and motor. The Study of Emotional Development in 1915. In both the manifesto and the presidential address, Watson had made substantial claims about the ability of behaviorism to deliver the applications that would improve the quality of human life based on conditioning. So when the opportunity came to study infants, Watson saw as a chance to apply behaviorism in a way that would convince the skeptics and secure his position as a leader in the application of psychological principles to improve society. Little Albert, 1920. From infant research, Watson had concluded that only a few stimuli would elicit the three instinctive emotions of fear, rage, and love. He attempted to demonstrate that the reason older children show these emotions, to which a higher range of stimuli, is because of conditioning, the well-known Little Albert story. In the Journal of Experimental Psychology, it was published as Conditional Emotional Reactions in 1920. It was also co-authored by Watson and Rosalie Rayner, who was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins. Watson's Theory of Behaviorism. The YouTube video titled Watson's Theory of Behaviorism states that Watson had famously claimed that if he were given a dozen healthy infants, he could shape them into anything regardless of their background. The first experiment he completed was with 8-month-old Albert, and later he applied his theory to his own children. With little Albert, classical conditioning was used, and he was conditioned to be afraid of a rat. The video also explains that his book had become a bestseller and that soon other scientists had begun to advise against showing affection. Some Western governments had also begun to hand out leaflets advising parents to stop kissing their children, and parents had developed an idea that children should be left crying alone at night until they fall asleep, which is a method called sleep training. A New Life in Advertising. Watson was forced to resign from Johns Hopkins due to his highly publicized divorce from Mary Ickes. Through the intercession of a friend, he joined the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency in New York City. During his internship, he served in all departments of the agency, and he rose to the position of vice president within 4 years. He was also able to put in practice his claims about the applicability of behaviorism. He developed several advertising campaigns around the themes that he derived from his research on the three basic emotions of fear, rage, and love. To sell a product to a consumer, Watson suggested that one must tell him something that will tie him up with fear, something that will stir up a mild rage, that will call out an affectionate or love response, or strike at a deep psychological or habit need. One example was Johnson & Johnson's baby powder, which is determined to scare parents into using the products because if they fail to use the baby powder, they risk exposing their children to serious infection. Popularizing Behaviorism, 1928. In his 1928 publication of Psychological Care of Infant and Child, Watson's reputation as an environmentalist was enhanced. This book contains Watson's strongest statements about how the technology of behavior could be brought to bear on most important tasks, and that is the raising of children. It was dedicated to the first mother who brings up a happy child. And he had begun it by stating the urgency of the task that happy babies are able to overcome the short-term effects of psychological deprivation. But once a child's character has been spoiled by bad handling, which can be done in a few days, who can say that damage is ever repaired? Watson also warned about being overly affectionate with children, with result being in the failure of the child to become responsible, independent, and ultimately successful in life. Watson did say later that he regretted writing a child-rearing book because he had realized that he really didn't know enough about it. Although it does stand as a perfect example of the faith that he had in the ability of behaviorism to affect daily living. It also illustrates the positive belief that understanding and control go hand in hand. Evaluating Watson's behaviorism, 1930. Watsonian behaviorism was a magnificent failure. It was never realized that being able to predict all responses given the stimulus. Most of his proclamations went far beyond the empirical evidence, and the data had never caught up to the excessive claims. Watson's strong beliefs are what keeps Watson's lasting importance to psychology. Behaviorism did not hold immediately, but Watson's forceful and repeated arguments started a process that brought behaviorism to the front and center of American experimental psychology. So he deserves the title of founder of behaviorism. By attacking introspective psychology directly and exposing its lack of objectivity, Watson was able to contribute to the gradual shift from psychology as a study of immediate conscious experience to psychology as a study of behavior. Watson's behaviorism bridged the gap between basic and applied psychology. The last and final page is the reference page.